This is the London Fintech Podcast, brought to you by your host, Mike Ballerman, bridging the worlds of suits and t-shirts, of finance and technology, bringing you insights, stories, and inspiration from the golden age of opportunity and innovation happening in London right now.
Hi, this is Mike Ballerman. This is London Fintech Podcast, episode 94, brought to you in association with Blue Motive Finance, Smart Pension, and I'm delighted to be joined today by, myself. Nevertheless, we shall plough on. Come the summer, it'll be an amazing 4 years of the LFP. Before that, it will be episode 100. So, in this New Year special, it really is about time to put some big picture context in here, which I haven't done since episode 001. At which point I recall an early supporter laughing at me for labelling it 001 on the basis that 100 was inconceivable. So, this year, no awards as such. To be honest, there seems to be rather an awards tsunami these days, although we'll have some honourable mentions. I shall rather summarise the overall state of the fintech sectors. It'll make a welcome change from one coalface, one tiny piece of the fintech mosaic at a time. After kicking off with a super big picture, how individual, society and US tech giants are and aren't adapting to the ubiquity of an internet world, we'll then pop in and see how the major fintech subsectors are doing. P2P, Bitcoin, blockchain, money, app-only banks, Insuretech, digital investment management, Regtech, payments and AI. And we'll end up with a school report card on what kind of kids these sectors have turned into over the past, in most cases, still not much more than 5 years since inception, and often less. So, as always, plenty to talk about, so let's get on with the show. And so it's good morning for me, or good afternoon, or good evening, or good night, I guess, depending on what time of day you're listening to it. Normally, this is my favourite part of the show, as I've taken to asking the guests just before we kick off for something more interesting than fintech to talk about. Of which the prior week's cycling from Max Pell is still in my mind. Cycling from Bangkok to Ho Chi Minh City in that heat is some big deal, even if Cambodia is rather flat. Which I guess leads me to the antithesis which affects many of us these days, and that is the problem of not moving much. It wasn't that long ago that the much vaunted lifestyle was the laptop on a beach. Let's leave out the idea of 4-hour working weeks in passing. That title merely won a contest for being the title that would sell most copies. At one's politest, that could possibly be described as a marketing-driven approach. From a more blunt perspective, it's outright disingenuous. Anyway, for sure in fintech, folks know that creating something in such a regulated and competitive sector as FS is a far, far more all-consuming task and can't be done from a beach. And there's the rub. In practice, we're all working significant hours in front of a PC. After all, it's the information age and the PC is the tool. And in my case, that has led to a great deal of becoming fat. Although giving up sugar, wheat, alcohol and snacking, and I'm down over 4 kilos in a month, so only a kilo or so off my target weight. Although to be fair, catching the Aussie flu was a major part of the LFP diet, though not one I'd entirely recommend. As well as the word fat, there's also the word fit. Talking of the slings and arrows of outrageous fortune, I came down with food poisoning last year, which is pretty acute. This led me to a YouTube channel by Agad Mator, a Croatian guy in his 30s, who really does interesting coverage of key chess games. I haven't played for decades, but he's just great Indian media. Interest and enthusiasm are contagious. Anyway, back to the generic passivity in front of the PC. He mentioned in passing his passive lifestyle, and that he was glad recently to be able to run for 10 minutes on an exercise machine without being out of breath. So this is something which is an equal age afflictor. But decent weight and fit is apparently only half the equation, or rather less than half. In 2017 I came across the concept of fit but sedentary. Well, actually I'm both unfit and sedentary, but maybe you're fit and sedentary. Anyway, as you might have read, it turns out that being sedentary is far worse for you than being fit is good. The gist of which is that if you don't move much for say 11.5 hours, and then leap around madly for the last half hour of the day, it doesn't offset the damage. To take one simple parameter, the lymph circulatory system, without which we'd all be dead, relies on movement to pump the lymph around the body. And we can assume that evolution designed us to be in motion for more than 30 minutes a day. And somehow I doubt that moving one's fingers on a keyboard or occasionally a hand on a mouse quite does the kind of movement that evolution designed us for. So, one of my challenges, and maybe yours, is getting fitter, but also finding some ways to be less sedentary. Easier said than done, as the idea of leaping up and doing a dozen star jumps or burpees every hour doesn't seem quite appealing. Answers on a postcard to LFP Towers. Evolution has barely had time to start culling the overly inactive in front of PCs, although sadly it's making faster inroads with social media. Eventually, of course, the human being what it is, will have adapted to the new world, but not yet. Before we move off, and just to scatter another seed for those of you who might want to water it, if you don't know about the amazing health impact of grounding yourself, check it out. It's not woo-woo, there are plenty of scientific studies done on it. In essence, the Earth, due to lightning, is negatively charged. For all of evolution, animals have been in electrical contact with it, apart from recent man, who, with carpets and shoes, is disconnected. It turns out that electrons are anti-inflammatory. Think antioxidants, negative ions and so forth. So being ungrounded, unearthed is pro-inflammatory, and virtually every big chronic modern illness is connected to inflammation, heart, cancer, etc. At a simple level, I use an earthing mat under my keyboard every day. And when I spend a day editing the LFP, free of ums and ers and stutters to make better use of your time, I notice a huge difference by the end of the day in terms of tiredness if I had the mat there or if for some reason it wasn't. Going back to YouTube brings us to what I see as a seismic shift in 2017 in the role of US tech, and more specifically, social media. YouTube, Patreon and others got into banning folks, and shadow banning turned from something that in 2016 only the likes of David Icke would speak about, into something more mainstream. Several indie accounts I dip into now and then were hit. Apparently AT&T and the like are neutral carriers. You and I chat and they have to let this happen. Social media is not the same, however. And in the massive, whipped-up hysteria over so-called Nazis, well, I guess it makes a change from the communist peril taking over America, and so-called alt-right, many old-fashioned liberals and folks just saying something other than the official mainstream narrative got caught. This isn't to say that there aren't nutters out there, but their net caught many sane folks. A prime example being the professor against PC, Jordan Peterson, who in his day job is one of the leading personality professors in the world at the University of Toronto, as well as a clinical psychologist. I mentioned en passant one of his podcasts about how valuable a children's story about dragons is for us all, and perhaps especially in the context of relationships. I'll link to it in the show notes. Anyway, he's a good example, as he has attracted huge enemies amongst the PC, SJW, deplatforming snowflakes for being against the expansion of PC well into overreach, especially around this idea that gender isn't biological but a choice, which has resulted in London Underground no longer saying ladies and gentlemen, as it's offensive, and the NHS not calling mums mums in case it offends dads who are having babies. In Canada, it has led to government-mandated pronouns, which Peterson is massively against, as well as potentially your kid being taken off you and put on puberty-delaying drugs. Absolutely shocking. In his case, he has put every lecture he ever did online, pretty much, and is on record many, many times as having said that political progress comes from a dialogue between liberal and conservative ideas interacting and testing each other. Despite years of uploads and millions of views, he's often banned or shadow banned, including, amazingly, by Google, who shut his email account without notice, and in the EU, a video where he talks about what he feels like when he's accused of being an extremist is itself banned. 2017 ended with a flurry of former Facebook executives regretting what they had done. Multiple studies, of course, show that social media is bad for your mental health, especially in the young. The official Facebook reply of, that's because you're using it wrong, and using it even more will help, belongs in the same waste disposal bin as 4-hour working weeks. Parley Hapitia, who was in charge of growing Facebook's global empire before leaving in 2011 to become a tech investor, said he feels tremendous guilt. I think we all knew in the back of our minds, even though we feigned this whole line of there probably aren't any really bad and unintended consequences, I think in the deep, deep recesses of our minds, we kind of knew something bad could happen. People need to hard break from some of these tools and the things that you rely on, the short-term, dopamine-driven feedback loops that we created are destroying how society works. There is no civil discourse, no cooperation, but misinformation and mistruth. Its former president, Sean Parker, has said Facebook is exploiting a vulnerability in human psychology, while Roger McNamee, an early investor, has accused it of using the techniques of Nazi propaganda chief Joseph Goebbels. If you like, this is all part of the painful transition of people and society to a world of interconnected computers. No doubt it'll be sorted out one way or another before our grandchildren are our age, but in the meantime, the transition is proving painful. Of course, zooming even more upwards here, this is conditioned by the state of the US Imperium. Maybe you think that's too big pick, but I guess most of you use Google, Amazon, YouTube, Microsoft, Facebook, Twitter, LinkedIn. So in the tech world, The US has roughly 100% control, outside most notably China. So any US policy is instantly promulgated worldwide. To give a podcast example, too much fruity Anglo-Saxon language from me, and the LFP would be rated parental advice. Now this would be logical, of course. After all, what kind of crazed parents would tell their kids to listen to this show? However, in the state of being parental advice, decided by Apple and unappealable, it is then not available for download in India through Apple devices, which would be a huge market to cut out. 2018 has seen lots of divisiveness in US society, by gender, by race, by ideology, by politics, and also within those identity groups. Feminism has rather mutated since I was young, from wanting equality of opportunity for women, being able to compete on a level playing field, to wanting equality of outcome, which is what, however the game went, we want the same result. As a result, neo-feminists busily attack not just men per se. I lost count of how many times last year I saw the words white and man used as derogatory terms on Twitter. But they also attack old feminist stalwarts like Germaine Greer, Camille Paglia and Christina Hoff Sommers. Not unsurprisingly, the latter make far more sense, having had 40 years more life experience. The fact that gender is a minefield was emphasised by James Damore losing his job at Google. He is now, I see, suing the most powerful company in the world. Good luck with that one. For pulling together the research on gender. A commitment to working out the truth is of little use these days. He was mercilessly slain yet again this morning, this time in The Guardian, by a neo-feminist whose sources were clearly articles about him and not his publicly available memo. In UK Fintech, there is much noise around its lack of so-called gender balance, especially in the tech part. But as Damore pointed out, in questions of identity, questions of preference never enter the equation. And a simple fact here that you might like to remember is that in the UK this year, only 10% of A-level computer science students were women. In those circumstances, is it the slightest surprise that one ends up with your techies being male? And in passing, to further this point, we might add that there's evidence that the distribution of male personality/ability is very fat-tailed. You may have noticed in history, for example, that most of the real serious nutters were male, and equally most of the geniuses. Gender itself, as in Canadian law, became enshrined as a social construct. You know you can change your gender on a whim just in your mind several times a day. This intra-identity group division is as true in gender. Jordan Peterson received 24 supportive letters from real transgender folks who would much rather have a quiet life and say that activists do not speak to them. And furthermore, having been through a hell of a lot of surgery and having to take hormones for the rest of their life, their whole point is actually to be identified as the other gender. Nor, by the way, is this far from Fintech. I saw a 2017 award for the best LGBT Fintech, which is a bit behind the times perhaps, as the alphabet soup has moved on. I recently saw LGBTQ2S. I never bothered really to find out what Q means, and I have no clue whatsoever as to the 2S. Affirmative action pro someone or a group is always action against another. There is perhaps a long overdue class action suit against the Ivy League schools for being anti-Asian American. A Princeton analysis shows that Asian Americans need 140 more SAT points, for example, to get into Harvard. All this division is clearly part of a societal process, but one whose waves spread far and fast. Indeed, the Marketing Companion podcast, which I listen to frequently, and being American bends over backwards to avoid religion and politics, even they mentioned that in the Second World War there was a force that pulled Americans together for the common good, whereas now there are only forces which tear it apart. Identity politics, group identity, PC overreach well beyond politeness into ideology. And that's before we get on to politics. Whether this is the beginning of the end for America remains to be seen. It's always in my mind that 75% of Americans did not vote for Hillary and 75% did not vote for Trump. And the vast majority of Americans don't believe that Washington acts in their interest, which is of course demonstrably correct. And nor in the UK are we any better in this Brexiting world with politicians who would make one weep if one thought about it. A recent headline over here was UK to tax tech giants if they fail to combat online extremism. But who defines extremism? Well, Twitter had to recently and has allegedly shut down 1 million so-called terrorist accounts in 2 years. But are there really a million terrorists in the world? A clue comes from a recent article I retweeted stating that Facebook has been closing accounts of Palestinians at the behest of the US and Israel. The US tech giants have become a tool of the US imperium. Meanwhile, Twitter, of course, overlooks state militaristic groups like armies, or rather the states that we like. Time and time again, surveys show that folks see the US and its puppet UK as the biggest terrorists in the world, and the number of deaths that are caused statistic backs that up. And if you want to dive a little deeper into who is a terrorist and who isn't, try looking at the Yemen if you can avoid tears flowing as a result of the humanitarian catastrophe down there. And so, this is the backdrop to how the internet, the technology of our age, evolves. Net neutrality is just a part. Will the internet become a corporate tool of immensely centralised power in the hands of, in essence, the US state and a handful of executives of the tech giants? After all, it was invented as a military project for decentralised communications. Or will we see a revolt against this? The dark web is perhaps another extreme in its own way, but maybe a people's net or a grey net will emerge. Mind you, the grey net will probably need better marketing and branding than being called grey. Who knows? But zooming in and getting around to fintech, we see some similar zeitgeist in Bitcoin. Originally intended and branded as a great strength of decentralization, mining long ago became massively centralized. Add to the fact that it's dead slow at settling transactions, as in gazillions of times slower than existing best mechanisms in FS, and the fact that it uses more electricity than 159 countries. I recently read in the FT more broadly that, I quote, "Stars including socialite Paris Hilton, actor James Fox and boxer Floyd Mayweather have all taken to social media to claim they are backing cryptocurrency fundraising." Oh my word. My elder came back from university and told me plenty of her chums are putting chunks of their student loan into Bitcoin. What could possibly go wrong? Blockchain has had zillions of dollars poured into its development, about 10% of which seems to have paid for folks to write to me continuously about the latest and greatest winning application which you dear listeners absolutely have to hear about. Notwithstanding which, the sole use of blockchain remains Bitcoin. I spoke at a recent conference on property. They were focusing on new technologies, which of course means, in that kind of context, AI and blockchain and their overhyped implications. In the break, I spoke to quite a few folks about whether they knew what an API was. None of them did. Of course, this is a far more fundamental and important thing, without which the internet would remain like single-celled life forms, and with which it becomes multicellular life forms. Anyway, moving on from the challenges and the negatives. Bitcoin 1.0 is a fascinating computer science and fintech experiment which will take its part in the evolutionary chain. And as to the value, who knows? Moving on to the part of fintech that speaks with a rather deeper voice. Peer-to-peer hasn't had an interesting year. Lending Club's share price is now down over 80% since its launch. That's unlucky. In the UK, Zopa, the originator of P2P worldwide, threw in the towel as I see it and started applying to become a bank. Of course, there's plenty of propaganda that it's going from strength to strength, and of course the management must do what it thinks is best for the business. But back to fintech business models. On the one hand, peer-to-peer has over the years both confounded the naysayers. Volumes continue to grow steadily. Even in the relatively small market of the UK, volumes long ago hit billions, which is quite a large number. And in turn, if the UK is roughly 10 times the size of European peer-to-peer, it's roughly 10% of America and 1% of China's, although China is a special case given the historic lack of consumer banking. On the other hand, peer-to-peer has not lived up to the highest expectations that, due to a superior model, in essence lower cost and newer tech, it could outcompete the banks. An interesting angle has always been overlooked that banks actually create this money thing, a huge advantage which fintech doesn't understand well enough in most cases. And it can also, of course, leverage enormously. So £1 of cash into a P2P turns into £1 of loan. But £1 of cash into a bank turns into, for the sake of argument, £10 of loans. So again, all fact packet here, peer-to-peers would always have to be 10 times more efficient than banks to outcompete the banks, big time. And of course, back to the nature of money. They would never get infinite marketplace, as there would literally then be no money around to pass around. In between the naysayers and the rosy scenarios lie reality. And in reality, the likes of Zopa have been closed for some time to new funds due to lack of opportunities. Funding circles eye-wateringly expensive TV ad, designed to increase market, my spies tell me has led to a flood of, unsurprisingly, poor quality borrowers. Anyway, peer-to-peer overall has had a solid performance, if not living up to its early potential, or expectations. I can see the odd float, funding circle being much vaunted in this context right now. It's an important option for borrowing and lending, but unless something radical changes, I really can't see it will ever be a tremendously big deal. As, apart from brand value, it's a very simple model and very replicable, as the likes of Goldman Sachs and others have shown. In terms of radical thinking, I mentioned my analysis before. Banking took a long time to get going in its current form and did so in large part due to an interbank market. However, the FCA put the mockers on that one by stopping so-called wholesale lending, i.e. one peer-to-peer lending to another. Albeit some confusing recent announcement about the legality, this may open a chink in the regulatory armour. The importance of the interbank market is that in a business model where on your left hand you've got X and on your right hand you've got Y, on any given day a bank either has too many X's coming its way or too many Y's. The ability of banks to lend, borrow from each other and swap their X and Y so they all balance out has been massively important in the creation of modern banking. The second point is that clearly P2Ps haven't managed to be 10 times, or whatever the number is, more efficient than banks. A third nonsensical idea from the past, which has by and large been dropped, was that P2Ps somehow had superior credit analysis. As the last episode with Max Pell highlights, Fintech as a whole is actually, behind the spin, focused much more on a simple customer journey than a really rich data analysis. Also, what is new after all in credit is not actually a lot, despite infinite column inches about social media data being vastly better. And there have been plenty of credit folks leaving banks for peer-to-peers, so there really isn't much different. The truth of this line of argument about the relative lack of unique impact by P2P is shown by the fact that in the government's long-trailed and expensively set-up mandatory bank referral scheme, that one that means that if you ask for a loan from a bank and you're a corporate, they can no longer say no, they have to say no, but check out the likes of funding options who may well be able to help you find a deal. The volumes of this so far have been pitiful. Why? Well, unsurprisingly for folks who've been in the lending game for centuries, their credit analysis is on the whole pretty good. Money, as I mentioned before, is much misunderstood. In LFP095, with David Clark of Positive Money, we dived into the nature of our private company-created debt-based money. The nature of money is at the root of many economic problems, as there is an inbuilt contradiction between 97% of all money being created by banks, who are of course focused on their own ends and their own profits, and the needs of society as a whole. A prime example of which Lord Turner is apt to quote is the preponderance of bank lending that goes to finance the purchase of pre-existing assets, thereby inflating the price. For example, house prices. It makes great sense for an individual bank to lend against property, safe as houses, being an expression of course. However, for society as a whole, the flood of lending over the past 40 years into house prices has been one of the major reasons for the inflation in house prices, which cuts off the young and poor. As Martin Wolf, the FT's chief economic commentator, said, "Our financial system is so unstable because the state first allowed it, the private banking sector, to create almost all the money in the economy and was then forced to insure it when performing that function. This is a giant hole at the heart of our market economies. It could be closed by separating the provision of money, rightly a function of the state, from the provision of finance, a function of the private sector." Another quotable quote from that episode was that in the UK it took 300 years for the money supply to reach £1 trillion. But from there, only 8 years to go to 2 trillion. And you wonder why asset prices are so high. Supply and demand, isn't it? The number of houses and shares out there hasn't changed much in a decade or so, but the amount of money has doubled. And, bereft of a real rethink, the Bank of England's QE programme has further exacerbated what I think is somewhat euphemistically called inequality. Next to no society ever on earth has not had inequality. Rather, a better phrase, a more direct phrase perhaps, is a society that is increasingly ripping off the vast majority. In the QE programme, £500 billion has gone to increase the wealth of banks and the rich, at the expense of the poor being left ever further behind. Actually, not just the poor and almost everybody else. In LFP092, the other notable big-picture episode, perhaps the world's leading expert on deconstructing shareholder value, McKinsey's and Harvard Business Review gave him their Article of the Year award for this in 2014, William Lazarnik shared with us how shareholder value is a cloak for a massive transfer of wealth to the managers at the top of corporations. We also had a history of shareholder value, and a great quote is, in 1984, no one at Harvard Business School was talking about shareholder value. By 1986, everyone was talking about it, and by 1990, it was the dominant ideology. I think it's a great quote, as it isn't just history, but it shows that in the right circumstances, new approaches, which we most certainly need, can flourish rapidly. Away from real social justice worrying is the topic of cash. Plenty of fintech warriors would naively wish to rub that out, or repeat ad nauseum the mantra that cash is getting out of fashion. The San Francisco Federal Reserve produced a report which looked at cash use in 42 economies across the globe, which together account for 75% of world GDP. Demand for notes and coins continues to match or outpace GDP in all major economies, bar Norway and Sweden. Now that's a quotable quote to remember. Money leads quite nicely into app-only banking. I guess the theme of the year has kind of been an updated Blur versus Oasis rivalry in the form of Revolut versus Monzo. I'll leave it to you folks to assign which is which. Monzo was my fintech to watch a year ago for 2017, although I should have, with hindsight, made it my one to watch for press impact and favourable media treatment award. They managed to roll out a current account last year, albeit one that's still lacking some of the usual current account features. And, well, I think that was it actually. My spies tell me they have not been helped by making the amateur error of using leading edge technology. This being an error, as although the siren call of the latest shiny thing is exactly what techies go after, what you end up with is spending quite a bit of your time solving leading edge tech problems as well as actually implementing your application. On the other hand, Nick Storonsky and the long hours crew at Revolut rolled out roughly 473 new products and promised 832 more, along with applying for a banking license. Well, I jest, but only slightly. There was a huge difference. Nick's presentation at Lendit 2017, link in the show notes if you haven't seen it already, was spectacular. These guys will either become the Amazon of fintech or the Chernobyl. There seems little chance of falling in between. All app banks were hugely hindered by payments partner processing problems. All tried for some time to fob this off on their partner. However, after a while, all but the fanboys spotted that always blaming your spouse rather overlooks the fact that you chose them. It is one of the true but more challenging than it appears lines about the web age that you can link all these Lego blocks on the interweb together and build something far faster. Yes, indeedy. But a chain is only as good as its weakest link, and ultimately your reputation is a function of your chain's weakest link. Profitability in app-only banking is a challenge, to put it mildly. Monzo have unimpressed me with their whining about losing money as, surprise, surprise, folks are using the products that they offered. Most notably, free ATMs abroad, which Monzo quotes discovered, unquotes, cost them money. Oh dear. So tariffs appeared. They also started complaining recently that being able to top up the account on your phone was costing them money. Whilst fanboys found all this perfectly reasonable, it's an open and shut switch and bait. I sell you X with benefits Y and Z, and you and all your friends take X from me, and I get lots of PR about how wonderful I am at growing my fantastic business. At which point I start whining to you that you're costing me money. Get out of here, dudes. I'm told by inside track folks that despite Tom's protestations, the real game plan here is to sell out, as there's no sight of any profitable model. The fact that Monzo now have something like half a dozen VCs makes the hunt for a liquidity event ever more likely. But invent something useful all these folks have. I've praised instant notifications and geolocated expenses before, but I had a real use case last year. I was in some amazingly noisy, trendy Shoreditch chocolate shop and tapped and paid for my chocolates. It was all a bit of mayhem in there, and about a minute or two later, the assistant said I had not tapped and paid and insisted that I tap and pay. Anyway, didn't continued until I whipped out my phone and demonstrated via the Monzo app that I had paid. If I'd used my usual credit card, I would have been stuffed. Not only stuffed, I'd have had to wait about 2 months until I got a statement and then go back to the chocolate shop and have some large argument that 2 months ago, blah, 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 blah. All of which brings us into the banking arena. This, of course, is too big to summarise. But 3 notable things going on are: 1. Some banks are really on the case. In LFP089, Alexander Ball of ING spoke about their more than 100 partnerships with fintechs. That's some going. It also points to the almost contradiction contained in this word fintech. As I've said, the majority of so-called fintech firms are actually new IT companies seeking to make incumbents stronger. In this light, once incumbents start dating and mating successfully, the majority of fintech creativity will be going into making incumbents stronger. A prospect almost entirely antagonistic to the fintechers who are the new indie FS providers. Secondly, a notable mention to Clearbank, the UK's first clearing bank for 250 years. Not only that, but a bank that keeps your, if you're a business, funds in this third category of money, rarely discussed, as it were Bank of England money, which means that there can never ever be a run on Clearbank. The third point of banking is open banking. Many electrons have been run through pixels on this one. Yeah, that's not very elegant, is it? I mean, it's not quite the same as many trees have been felled, is it? Anyway, let's see how open banking pans out. Much hyped, and I wonder where the reality will lie. Shakeouts happen across the sector, and it's always a dangerous niche being an intermediary. In 2017, Startup Bootcamp, one of London's leading incubators, accelerators, and stars of the early days of fintech, shut up shop. At the opposite extent, in the more focused pure conduit, and not allegedly entrepreneur school, which of course were always rarely run by entrepreneurs who would tire of repeating the same curriculum, is Illuminate Financial, whose LFP077 showcased the real task of helping B2B tech fintechs and the banks who would benefit from them mate successfully and are notably a partner of successful ING. Insurance had formerly been a bit of a dull subset of fintech, with only a handful of players making any real inroads. However, things hotted up in 2017 as a result of models like Reinsurance as a Service from Munich Re, which we discussed in LFP094, and other insurance players offering similar /mutatis mutandis offerings. Notably interesting Insuretechs were NEOS in LFP084, with their protected home thrown in for free alongside usual priced home insurance, and showing that creativity is ever springing, a rare LFP dive into the startup world with Floodflash in LFP088, with their memorable stat that most UK SMEs based in floodplains don't have flood insurance. Stick that in your credit assessment, folks. In terms of growing up and moving on, the online investment management sector continues to develop. Nutmeg has been rather more of a slow burn than originally forecast, which fact saw the founder deposed some time back, but recently became the first UK digital wealth manager to reach £1 billion in assets under management. Scalable Capital are on a rather faster growth track, having reached around £500 million in 2 years from launch, a hugely impressive achievement. My critique of digital managers is that they're far from offering digital fees. In fact, they offer not far from traditional fees. In this light, pension aggregator PensionBee's recent fee cut to a low of 0.25% is a step in the right direction. Citigroup alone has 40,000 compliance officers, which gives you some idea of the madness of the regulation by minutiae we have right now. If ever FS regulators ran aviation, no aircraft would be light enough to get off the ground. So this is a huge potential market for Regtech, but I'm reminded of some prominent VC, one of whose rules when choosing what to invest in is neither too small a market nor too big a market. Forever hyped is Regtech, what isn't I guess these days, but I will fall off my chair when a Regtech enables Citigroup to get rid of even 10% of its compliance officers. And of course, having fallen off my chair, I shall pick up my microphones and run after them. Payments is a rare example where regulation has increased competition. Always a slow burn. I've got a cracking payments firm coming on the LFP very soon, so let's wait for them. AI or machine learning has been ludicrously overhyped to almost sci-fi levels. Well, actually, to sci-fi levels, and generally by folks with no background in computer science. By far the most fascinating application so far, which the far-sighted in Fintech would be well advised to dive into, is Google's AlphaZero, which in one version defeated the world Go champion, a first. In chess, computers have long since been far better than humans. AlphaZero defeated Stockfish, one of the best problems, hands down, although if you want to quibble, there wasn't an entirely level hardware context. But this isn't the real point. Both AlphaZero for Go and AlphaZero for chess were only given the rules of the game and had to train themselves by playing themselves into what good play constitutes. On special hardware, it took AlphaZero only 3 hours from having no knowledge of how to play good chess to far surpass the best human-coded program. Phenomenal achievement. Not only this, but it plays an adventurous and exciting form of chess. It's as if Martians turned up and showed us, and existing programs, a completely different way of playing the game. I'll include a link in the show notes to Agad Mator's commentary on some of these games. Contextualising this and removing the hyper-nonsense. It's no big deal, is it, that your car is faster than you? It's a machine designed to do that. Equally, it's no big deal that a computer can play better chess than you. It's a machine designed to do that. Talk of learning is a great intro for inane article writers. However, this learning is very narrow. The core technology are neural nets. Stripping this of the anthropomorphic language, neural networks are simply, quotes simply, non-linear function approximators. What's a non-linear function, perchance you ask? Well, a non-linear function is, say, let's take your height and square it and add 1 divided by your weight and multiply that to your shoe size to the power of 3/4. That's a non-linear function. So let's simplify. Let's say we pick a function to represent the value of a chess position. The so-called learning is just choosing one set of parameters and another, and using these evaluation functions to generate moves. One set of parameters will be better than the other, and then that will be the basis of the next iteration. Games are particularly amenable to this, as whilst complex, chess is simply 64 squares, which are either empty or have one of 18 types of piece on them. Nonsense about these computers learning to take over the world, choose your mate or replace us all, is just more trash media. Nevertheless, back to the reality of computer science, this is an amazingly impressive achievement. Back to the real world, we are not talking about, as one especially stupid headline I saw last year said, sex robots should be given rights. But rather, the challenge here is that these powerful technologies are in the hands of the very same US tech giants we started the show with. But I guess we shouldn't perhaps worry too much about that, as the chances are they will use it just to show us different ads, or facilitate the state spying in even more detail on its citizens. So, before we wrap up the show, I'd like to thank all of you listeners out there. I value all of you, and it's always nice to meet you and hear from you, and my brand partners of the podcast. Blue Motive Finance combine extensive experience with a fresh and innovative approach. Blue's award-winning technology has supported over £500,000 of lending to over 50,000 customers. Smart Pension, who are fast, secure and free. Check out their UK workplace pensions at autoenrolment.co.uk. Okay, so the landing lights are on and the runway is in sight. I've read a few books about the Lakota in recent years. You may know them as the Sioux, although Sioux is a slang word derived from their enemies and the French, meaning little devils or demons, so it's hardly polite. Anyway, they, and this is shared with most of the original nations, have an important phrase, Mitakoye Oyasin, which means all our relatives, which is meant very broadly, perhaps even more broadly than Buddhism's all sentient beings. They also retain the idea that one day the Europeans will need to learn from them. Mitakoye Oyasin is a really important phrase. Whatever single facet of our being we may focus on, prick us and we will all bleed. Prick us and we will all bleed red blood. If Martians invaded, we sure would unify as one race, one tribe. I'm pleased to say that in my experience, the London Fintech scene is one of the most liberal and tolerant scenes going on. In the summer, given all the fuss, I actually went as far as asking half a dozen CEOs that I know so well they'd be honest with me, whether gender, in the scientific biological sense, matters in interviews. Everyone stated that not only did it not, nothing else mattered to them other than how good folks were at the job. Now this is clearly a utilitarian perspective. Being a CEO and keeping your fintech afloat is far harder than it looks, and you need absolutely the best person you can get. But I also do like to think that it's a cultural one. London is a super open place with more nationalities than perhaps anywhere in the world. As Yoda said, always in motion the future is. Will we continue to see more tribalism and tribes within tribes attacking each other on the battlefronts of media, mainstream and social? Will the filtering of Facebook et al. Be the seeds of their own destruction in favour of decentralised peer-to-peer networks? We shall see. So far, big red buttons aside, it's been a never-ending story. Which brings us finally to the headmaster's report card. What are the one-liners at the bottom of the card? P2P. Lapsed into an early middle age, needs an affair to sex it up. Bitcoin. Dropped out and took lots of drugs. Having a whale of a time, but dropping out and doing drugs doesn't predict a great future. Blockchain. Parents and teachers tell me it's got huge potential. I'm still waiting. App-only banks. A teenager keen on telling its parents how it knows far more than they, needs to get a job and make some money. Insuretech. A slow starter, never appeared anywhere in the annual exam list, suddenly got its head down and now appearing in the annual prizes. Digital investment management. A hipster on the outside, although inside rather more like its parents than it would care to admit. Regtech. That kid in the corner who so far shows no signs of greatness. Payments. The fat kid who starts losing a bit of weight, gets fitter and starts attracting the attention of the opposite sex for the first time. AI. Much arousal over status as a sex bomb, but still underage. On which note, all that remains for me is to wish you a fantastic, happy and prosperous 2018 for yourself, your businesses and all your relatives, near and far. Live long and prosper. Thanks for listening. If you have consulting, advisory/non-exec or media needs in the FS or fintech space, get in touch with me at mike@londonfintechpodcast.com.
We could sit in a bend there all day, watching the firelight dance, watching the firelight dance. We could walk in the mountains before dawn, watching a happy moonrise, watching a happy moonrise. Come away from the city, with the tarmac so dead and the people so sad. Come away from the city, with the faces so grey, with the pain of the everyday. the mountains and the trees. Can you see what I mean? Can you see what I mean? We fade in between the earth and the sky. Kiss the city goodbye. Wave the city goodbye. Wave the city goodbye. Wave the city goodbye. Watch the firelight dance with me. 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 Watch the firelight dance.